The room smelled faintly of polish and aged mahogany, the kind of scent that seemed almost tailored for somber occasions like this. Amy fidgeted in her chair, her fingers tracing the grooves of the oak armrest as she avoided looking at her siblings. She hadn't seen Victor or Claire in years, not since their father's 60th birthday party, which had ended in shouting matches and slammed doors. Now, they were here again, gathered in their father's lawyer's office, pretending the rift didn't exist. Victor sat across from her, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that seemed out of character. He had always been the bold, commanding one, the family's golden boy. But today, he looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. Claire sat beside him, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically on the arm of her chair. The youngest of the three, she had always been the diplomat, trying to mediate their squabbles. But even Claire seemed tense, her polished veneer slipping under the weight of whatever grudges she was suppressing. "Thank you for coming," the lawyer, Mr. Sterling, began as he shuffled papers on his desk. His voice was low, deliberate, as though each word needed to be carefully placed. "Your father, Gerald Fairmont, was a complicated man. He valued privacy, and as such, this may contain revelations." Amy's stomach tightened. Gerald Fairmont had been many things. Distant, demanding, sometimes cruel, but predictable was not one of them. His death a week ago, from a heart attack, had been sudden, but not entirely shocking. At 68, his health had been declining, though he'd kept that fact as private as everything else in his life. Revelations? Claire's voice was cautious, a subtle quiver betraying her unease. "Yes," Mr. Sterling said, glancing at them with an unreadable expression. "I think it's best if I proceed directly with the reading." Amy exchanged a wary glance with Claire, but Victor stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Mr. Sterling began, his voice filling the room. "To my children, Amy Fairmont, Victor Fairmont, and Claire Fairmont, I leave my love and my regrets for the years I could not give to you as a father should." Amy snorted softly under her breath. Regrets. That was rich. Mr. Sterling continued without pausing. "To each of you, I leave the sum of $100,000, with the hope that you will use it to find peace, fulfillment, and perhaps reconciliation." The room went still. "That's it?" Victor's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "No," Mr. Sterling said, his gaze dropping back to the papers. "There is one more provision." Amy's heart pounded as the lawyer cleared his throat. "To my daughter, Ella Fairmont, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and liquid assets." For a moment, no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible. "Who the hell is Ella Fairmont?" Victor finally demanded, his voice a thunderclap in the quiet room. Claire paled, her perfectly lined lips parting in stunned silence. Amy just stared at Mr. Sterling, her mind spinning. "Ella is Gerald's daughter," the lawyer said carefully, "from a relationship he maintained for over 2 decades. Victor shot out of his chair, his fists clenched. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of sick joke?" "I assure you, it's not," Mr. Sterling replied, his voice steady. "Ella has been informed of the will's contents and will be joining us shortly." The door to the office creaked open before anyone could react. A woman stepped inside, her presence commanding. She was tall, with chestnut hair that spilled over her shoulders, her features sharp and strikingly familiar. Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on each stunned sibling. "Hello," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "I'm Ella." The air in the room seemed to solidify, pressing down on everyone. Amy's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the woman who had just walked in. Ella. She didn't look much older than Claire. Late 20s, maybe 30 at most. But there was an unmistakable poise about her that none of the Fairmont siblings possessed. Victor broke the silence first. "You can't just walk in here and pretend you belong." His voice was a mix of anger and disbelief, but there was something else there, too. Fear. Ella raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I'm not pretending. I'm here because our father wanted me to be." "Our father?" Claire repeated, her voice trembling. "You're not seriously expecting us to believe?" I don't expect anything, Ella interrupted, stepping farther into the room. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she moved with unnerving confidence. But I've lived with this secret my entire life. I'm not the one who hid it from you. Amy finally found her voice, though it came out sharper than she intended. You've known about us? All these years. Ella's expression softened, but her eyes remained calculating, as if she were gauging just how much to reveal. Yes, I've known. He told me about you when I was a teenager. He always said he'd find the right time to introduce us, but I guess that time never came. Victor let out a bitter laugh. Of course it didn't. That's because he knew this would blow up his perfect little family image. Perfect? Claire muttered, crossing her arms. You mean the family where we all barely speak to each other? Amy could feel the cracks forming, the old wounds reopening. She turned her attention back to Ella. Why now? Why would he leave everything to you? I asked the same question, Ella admitted, her voice quieter now. But I think it's obvious. He wanted to make things right with me, even if it was too late to do it while he was alive. Amy shook her head, her hands balling into fists. So we were just some side project he forgot about? And you get to swoop in and claim everything? Ella's composure faltered, just for a moment. I didn't ask for this. Do you think I wanted to grow up knowing my father was with his real family, while my mother and I were a secret? Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly recovered. This isn't about money. It's about the life he denied me, and you, apparently. Victor pointed a finger at Ella, his face flushed with anger. Don't you dare act like you're the victim here. We're the ones who had to put up with him. His demands, his rules, his... Enough. Mr. Sterling's voice cut through the chaos. He stood, hands planted firmly on his desk. I understand this is an emotional moment, but I must ask you all to remain civil. There's more to discuss. What else could there possibly be? Claire asked, her voice thick with sarcasm. Mr. Sterling glanced at Ella, then back at the others. Your father left instructions for a second meeting, to take place in 1 week. Ella is in possession of certain documents that he wished to be shared with all of you at that time. Until then, I suggest you take some time to process. What documents? Amy asked, her voice rising. Mr. Sterling shook his head. I'm afraid I can't disclose that. Ella, as the executor of his estate, will provide the details when the time comes. Victor let out a scoff, throwing his hands in the air. Of course. This whole thing is one last manipulation, isn't it? Ella stepped forward, her expression unreadable. I don't know what's in those documents. All I know is that he said they would explain everything. Explain everything? Claire repeated bitterly. I doubt that. The siblings rose one by one, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Amy lingered for a moment, staring at Ella, trying to find some crack in her armor, something to make her feel less like the interloper she was. But Ella simply met her gaze, calm and unwavering. I didn't choose this, Ella said softly, almost too softly for anyone else to hear. But I'm not going anywhere. Amy didn't remember the drive home. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The streets blurred past, a mix of gray skies and barren trees, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying Ella's calm demeanor, the lawyer's monotone declarations, and the gnawing weight of her father's betrayal. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her modest townhouse, Amy stayed in the car, staring at the dashboard. Her husband, Mark, had been texting her, but she hadn't responded. Not yet. She couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. Inside, she found Mark sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowing. You okay? He asked, closing the magazine and leaning forward. No, Amy said bluntly, dropping her bag onto the counter. You won't believe what happened. Mark listened quietly as Amy recounted the events, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. When she finished, he leaned back, exhaling sharply. So, you have a half-sister? Apparently, Amy muttered, crossing her arms. And she gets everything. Every house, every penny. Meanwhile, Victor, Claire, and I get crumbs. Do you think it's true? Mark asked. Amy hesitated. I don't know. She looks like him in a way. And the lawyer wouldn't lie about something like this, would he? Mark shrugged. Maybe not. But it's weird your dad kept it a secret for so long. Weird didn't begin to cover it, Amy thought. Meanwhile, at Victor's apartment, Victor paced the length of his living room, his phone pressed to his ear. I know you said he was distant, he said, his voice tight with frustration. But did you know about this? No, Vic, I didn't, his mother said on the other end. Her tone was weary, as though Gerald Fairmont's shadow still loomed over her, even in death. We divorced for a reason. Your father always had secrets. But this? A whole other family? I'm as shocked as you are. Victor stopped pacing, his jaw clenching. It's not just the secret. He gave her everything, Mom. Every damn thing. There was a pause. Victor, you don't need his money. That's not the point, he snapped. It's the principle. It's like we didn't matter to him. Like she was more important than his real kids. She's his real kid too, his mother said softly. Victor hung up without replying. At Claire's loft, Claire sat curled up on her sofa, a glass of wine balanced on her knee. Her best friend, Lena, sat across from her, listening intently. Do you think she's lying? Lena asked. No, Claire said, swirling her wine. She knew too much. Her mannerisms, they were just like Dad's. And what about the money? Claire sighed. It's not about the money. It's about what it means. Dad always made us feel like we had to earn his approval. And now, here comes Ella, and she just gets it all. Maybe it's his way of making up for something, Lena offered. Or maybe he was just a coward, Claire muttered, hiding behind lawyers and secret meetings instead of facing us while he was alive. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling between them. A week later, the second meeting, the siblings arrived at the lawyer's office separately, each radiating tension. Amy sat stiffly in her chair, her arms crossed. Victor stood by the window, glaring at nothing in particular. Claire sat in silence, her hands gripping her purse tightly. Ella was already there when they arrived, seated calmly with a folder in her lap. She gave them a polite nod, but no one returned it. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat as he entered the room, carrying a stack of papers. Thank you all for coming. As per Gerald Fairmont's wishes, Ella has brought the documents that will shed light on his decision. All eyes turned to Ella as she opened the folder and slid several pages onto the table. The siblings leaned in reluctantly, their curiosity outweighing their resentment. The first page was a letter, written in their father's unmistakable handwriting. Amy's heart thudded as she began to read. To my children, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know what I've done will be difficult for you to understand, but I hope this letter and the accompanying documents will provide clarity. Ella is your sister. I met her mother, Margaret, many years ago, during a difficult time in my life. It was not a decision I made lightly, but it was one I could not undo. I loved her and Ella in a way that does not diminish my love for you. But I failed all of you by trying to keep these worlds separate. The letter continued, growing heavier with each word. It explained how Gerald had split his time between two lives, always intending to come clean but never finding the courage. I can't believe this, Victor muttered, his voice shaking. He was living a double life. And we were just the backup family? Keep reading, Ella said quietly. The next document was a birth certificate, confirming Ella's parentage. The third was a photo of Gerald holding a young Ella in his arms, his face uncharacteristically soft. Amy stared at the photo, her throat tight. For years, she had craved that kind of affection from him. Now, seeing it so freely given to Ella, she felt something break inside her. Why are you even here? Claire finally snapped at Ella, tears brimming in her eyes. What do you want from us? Ella looked at her, calm but resolute. I don't want anything. I just want you to know the truth. He wasn't perfect, and neither was what he did to any of us. But we're still his family, whether you like it or not. The silence that followed Ella's words was suffocating. Amy's gaze lingered on the photograph of their father cradling Ella, a serene smile on his face that she couldn't remember ever seeing. It felt like a betrayal, not just the secret, but the affection he had so easily displayed for someone else. Victor broke the silence, his voice cold and sharp. So, what? You show us some documents, flash a few photos, and we're supposed to welcome you with open arms? Ella didn't flinch. I'm not asking for a warm welcome, Victor. I'm not asking for anything. But whether you accept it or not, I'm your sister. And our father wanted me to be part of your lives. Our father, Victor repeated bitterly, his hands curling into fists. You mean the man who spent years lying to all of us? The man who had no problem playing house with two different families? Claire looked down at the table, her voice trembling. How did your mother let this happen? Did she even care that he had a family? Ella's calm demeanor wavered for the first time. Her jaw tightened, and she looked Claire directly in the eyes. My mother didn't let anything happen. She didn't know about you, not at first. When she found out, she was devastated. But by then, I was already here, and leaving wasn't as simple as you might think. So, she stayed, Claire said, her voice laced with judgment. Ella nodded. She stayed, for me. She didn't want me to grow up without a father. I'm not saying it was right, but it wasn't easy for her either. Victor scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Well, congratulations. You got the better version of him. All we ever got was the drill sergeant who made us feel like we weren't good enough. Amy flinched at his words, but she couldn't disagree. Gerald Fairmont had been a man of high expectations and low affection, a father whose love always felt like something to be earned rather than freely given. I didn't have it easy, Ella said softly. He wasn't exactly warm with me either. He tried, but he was always torn. I know what he did to all of us was wrong, but that doesn't mean we have to keep tearing each other apart. Amy's head snapped up. Tearing each other apart? You walked in here and dropped a bomb on us, Ella, and now you expect us to just move past it? I don't expect anything, Ella said firmly, but he wanted us to have a chance to be a family, even if it's messy, even if it takes time. Later that evening, Amy couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in her mind. Mark lay beside her, his breathing steady, but she could feel his concern even in his sleep. Her father's letter sat on the nightstand, folded neatly. She had read it 3 times, trying to find some comfort in his words, but all she felt was anger and confusion. How could he justify what he'd done? How could he ask her to embrace someone who had taken so much from them? Unable to stay still, she slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, her thoughts racing. Why hadn't her father told them the truth while he was alive? Why had he chosen now, when it was too late for questions, too late for answers? Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Claire. Claire, are you awake? Amy hesitated before typing back. Amy, yeah. Claire, I can't stop thinking about it. Do you think she's telling the whole truth? Amy frowned. Amy, I don't know, but I don't think she's lying. There was a long pause before Claire replied. Claire, I hate that he did this to us. I hate that he left us with her. Amy stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She didn't know what to say, because part of her agreed. Meanwhile, at Victor's apartment, Victor poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass as he stared at the stack of documents he had taken from the meeting. The photo of Ella and their father lay on top, mocking him with its simplicity. He took a long sip, the burn doing little to dull the anger simmering inside him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unknown number. Hello, he answered gruffly. Victor, it's Ella. His grip tightened on the glass. What do you want? I know you're angry, Ella said, her voice steady. You have every right to be, but I thought you might want to know something. What could you possibly have to tell me? He snapped. There was a pause on the other end of the line. My mother kept diaries. She wrote about everything, how she met him, what he told her about your family. I think you deserve to read them. Victor's jaw tightened. Why would you give those to me? Because you deserve the truth, Ella said simply. And maybe it'll help you see that none of this was your fault. Victor didn't respond, but his mind raced. I'll send them to you, Ella continued. If you don't want to read them, that's your choice. But I think you should. Before he could reply, the line went dead. Victor stared at his phone, his heart pounding. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or furious, but he couldn't deny the small flicker of curiosity growing inside him. A week after their father's secrets had come to light, the Fairmont siblings met one last time, at their childhood home. It had been years since they'd all been there together, the grand house now feeling both imposing and hollow without Gerald Fairmont's stern presence. Amy, Victor, and Claire sat in the living room, each lost in their own thoughts. Ella arrived last, holding a box that she set carefully on the coffee table. "This is it," she said softly, gesturing to the box. "My mother's diaries. They explain everything. How she met our father, why she stayed, and what he told her about all of you." Victor scoffed, but his anger had lost some of its fire. "So, this is supposed to make us feel better? Reading about how he lived 2 lives and lied to everyone?" Ella met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "No, it's not about feeling better. It's about understanding. You can't change what he did, but maybe this will help you make sense of it." Amy leaned forward, her hands trembling as she opened the box. The diaries were neatly stacked, their worn covers hinting at years of use. She hesitated before picking one up, flipping through the pages. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," Ella said. "I'm not here to force anything, but I think you deserve the truth, even if it's hard to hear." Claire reached for one of the diaries, her fingers brushing against the leather cover. "What if it just makes everything worse?" Ella's expression softened. "It might, but at least you'll know it all, good or bad. And then, maybe, we can start moving forward." The room fell silent as the siblings exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Claire opened the diary and began to read aloud. An excerpt from the diary. March 15th, 1994. "I didn't expect him to walk into the gallery that day, let alone stop at my booth. Gerald Fairmont. I recognized him instantly from the papers, the photographs. He was powerful, charismatic, and so utterly out of reach that I almost laughed when he introduced himself. He said my paintings reminded him of home, of things he'd lost. I didn't ask what he meant. It didn't feel like my place. But when he asked if I'd join him for coffee, I said yes. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. He told me about his family, his children. He didn't hide them from me. He said he loved them but felt trapped by the life he'd built. He said he wasn't looking for an escape, just a connection. I believed him. God help me. I believed him." The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth none of them had been ready for. Claire closed the diary, tears streaming down her face. "He told her about us," she said, her voice trembling. "He wasn't even trying to hide it." Victor stood abruptly, pacing the room. "So, what? He wasn't lying to her, but he lied to us? How does that make any sense?" "It doesn't," Amy said, her voice hollow. "None of this makes sense." Ella watched them, her own emotions carefully guarded. "He was flawed. We all know that. But I think he was trying to do right by all of us in his own way, even if he failed." Victor stopped pacing, his fists clenched. "You keep defending him. Why?" "Because he was my father too," Ella said, her voice breaking for the first time. "And because I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough for him to choose just one life. Maybe I'm defending him because I'm trying to convince myself it wasn't my fault." The room fell into a stunned silence. For the first time, the siblings saw the cracks in Ella's armor, the pain that mirrored their own. Amy spoke softly. "You didn't ask for this, did you?" Ella shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, but I'm here now, and whether you like it or not, we're family." 3 months later, the Fairmont siblings were scattered across the lawn of their father's estate, sorting through boxes and furniture as they prepared to sell the property. It was bittersweet, the memories of their childhood blending with the lingering sting of their father's secrets. Ella had been quiet, keeping her distance, but Amy noticed her sitting on the porch, staring out at the sprawling yard. She walked over, hesitating before sitting beside her. "I didn't think you'd come back," Amy admitted. Ella smiled faintly. "Neither did I. But I guess I wanted to see it one last time. The place he called home." Amy nodded, the silence between them feeling less strained than before. "Victor's still angry," Amy said. "He has every right to be," Ella replied. But maybe one day he won't be. Amy studied her half-sister, the woman who had turned their lives upside down. For all her resentment, she couldn't deny the strength it had taken for Ella to face them, to stand in the middle of their grief and anger without turning away. Maybe one day, we won't be either, Amy said quietly. Ella looked at her, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the estate, Amy felt the faintest shift in her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start.